welcome, dear listener, to a place where mysteries come alive. Here, we bring you timeless tales of clever detectives, hidden motives, and unexpected twists. Whether it's the daring charm of Tommy and Tuppence, or the keen intellect of Poirot, every story invites you to think, to feel, and to solve the case. Stay curious, and welcome to Guardian of the Night Stories. The summer of 1935 had been uncommonly warm, and even in the drawing room of his London flat, Hercule Poirot found himself adjusting the angle of his electric fan with the precision he brought to all matters. Great and small, he had just arranged his morning correspondence in 3 neat piles. Urgent, moderately pressing, and those which could wait indefinitely, when his manservant, Georges, announced a visitor. "A Miss Claudia Mersham to see you, sir. She says the matter is most urgent." Poirot's eyebrows, which were as meticulously groomed as his famous moustaches, rose slightly. "Show her in, Georges, and perhaps some English tea. The young ladies, they always appreciate the tea when they come to confide their troubles to Hercule Poirot." Miss Claudia Mersham proved to be a striking woman of perhaps 30 years, dressed in the height of fashion, but with an air of distraction that suggested her mind was far from considerations of style. Her dark eyes held a mixture of anxiety and determination as she settled into the chair Poirot indicated. "Monsieur Poirot," she began without preamble, "I believe my cousin is going to be murdered." Poirot steepled his fingers beneath his chin, a gesture that had become habitual when considering matters of interest. "That is indeed a serious concern, mademoiselle. But perhaps we should begin at the beginning, yes? You will take some tea?" "Thank you, no. I'm far too agitated." She drew a breath, composing herself. "My cousin, Geoffrey Mersham, is celebrating his 50th birthday next weekend at his country house Willowmere in Sussex. It's to be a grand affair. He's invited 24 guests for the weekend. The family will be there, of course, and various friends and business associates." "And what leads you to believe that your cousin is in danger?" Miss Mersham extracted a folded paper from her handbag with fingers that trembled slightly. "I found this in his study 3 days ago. I'd gone to Willowmere early to help with the preparations, you see." Poirot took the paper and unfolded it carefully. The message, composed of letters cut from newspapers and magazines, was brief and chilling. "You will not see another birthday." "Most unpleasant," Poirot murmured. "And your cousin, he has seen this?" "Yes, I took it to him immediately. But Geoffrey merely laughed it off as a tasteless joke. He said he had no enemies, that it was probably the work of some village prankster." Her voice rose with frustration. "But, Monsieur Poirot, I know better. My cousin is a wealthy man who has made his fortune in business. Not everyone who deals in commerce conducts themselves with perfect integrity." "You suggest that your cousin has enemies?" "I suggest that my cousin may not even know who his enemies are." She leaned forward intently. "Monsieur Poirot, will you come to Willowmere? Geoffrey has agreed to invite you as a guest for the weekend. I told him you were an acquaintance of mine interested in English country houses. He doesn't know I've consulted you professionally." Poirot considered. The little grey cells, they were intrigued. A country house, a birthday celebration, an anonymous threat, and the victim himself dismissing the danger. It was, as the English would say, a recipe for disaster. "Very well, mademoiselle. Hercule Poirot will accept this invitation, and I shall bring with me my good friend Captain Hastings, if that is acceptable. He is most useful for, how do you say, keeping the eyes and ears open." Miss Mersham's face flooded with relief. "Oh, thank you, Monsieur Poirot. Thank you. The party begins Friday evening. I've taken the liberty of having Geoffrey's secretary send you a formal invitation." She rose to leave, then paused. "There's one more thing you should know. Geoffrey changed his will last month. Several people stand to benefit or lose, considerably depending on its contents, but he's refused to discuss the details with anyone. After she had gone, Poirot sat in contemplation, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his chair. Georges appeared to clear away the tea things. "We are going to the country, Georges," Poirot announced. "You will pack my weekend case with the usual care, and telephone to Captain Hastings. Tell him we have a case that requires his invaluable assistance." "Very good, sir. Shall I include your green-labelled pomade for the moustaches? The country air can be most drying, but naturally, what would be the point of solving a murder if one's moustaches were not maintained in a state of absolute perfection?" Captain Arthur Hastings, that most loyal of friends and most confused of Watsons, met Poirot at Victoria Station on Friday afternoon. As their motor car wound through the Sussex countryside, Hastings listened with growing concern to Poirot's account of Miss Mersham's visit. "I say, Poirot, this sounds rather serious. An anonymous threat, you say, and the fellow won't take proper precautions? It is the way of the successful man, Hastings. He believes himself invulnerable. He has conquered in business, in society. Why should he fear a piece of paper with the letters cut from the Daily Mail? Still, one ought to be careful. What do we know about this Geoffrey Mersham? Ah, there I have made the inquiries." Poirot extracted a small notebook from his pocket. "Monsieur Geoffrey Mersham, 50 years of age tomorrow. Made his fortune in importing. Textiles from the East primarily. Widowed 5 years ago, no children. Lives at Willowmere with his younger sister, Mrs. Helena Cartwright, who is also a widow. The household includes his secretary, a Monsieur Philip Daventry, and the usual staff." "And the guests for this birthday celebration? That is most interesting, my friend. There is, of course, Miss Claudia Mersham, who consulted me. Then there is a business partner, a Mr. Edmund Crowe and his wife. There is also a rival in business, a Mr. James Blackwood, which is curious, no? One invites one's rival to one's birthday party. Perhaps they're friends despite being competitors. Perhaps. We shall see. There is also a retired colonel, Colonel Hugh Bantry, and his wife. Old friends of the family, a Miss Dorothea Sims, who was once engaged to Geoffrey Mersham many years ago, a young couple, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Fletcher. He is a nephew by marriage, and various others. In all, it will be quite the gathering." Willowmere proved to be a gracious Georgian manor house set in extensive grounds, its honey-coloured stone glowing in the late afternoon sun. They were greeted by the butler, a dignified man named Parsons, who showed them to their rooms with the practised efficiency of the professional servant. Poirot's room overlooked the rose garden, where several guests were already taking tea on the terrace. He could see a tall, distinguished man with iron-grey hair holding court among a group of admirers. This would be Geoffrey Mersham himself, no doubt. Beside him sat a woman who bore a strong family resemblance, though her features were softer, more delicate. The sister, Mrs. Cartwright, presumably. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said, adjusting his tie in the mirror. "Let us go down and observe. Remember, we are merely guests who admire the English country house. We observe, we listen, but we do not interrogate. Not yet. The terrace was a scene of elegant summer leisure. Geoffrey Mersham proved to be every inch the successful businessman, confident, charming, with the easy manner of one accustomed to command. He greeted Poirot and Hastings warmly. "Delighted you could come, Monsieur Poirot. Claudia tells me you're quite the connoisseur of architecture. You must let me show you the long gallery. Some rather fine portraits of dubious ancestors." "You are most kind, monsieur, and may I offer my congratulations on your birthday? 50 tomorrow, half a century. Rather makes one think, doesn't it? but there was no trace of melancholy in his tone, only robust satisfaction with life. Mrs. Helena Cartwright approached, accompanied by a thin, scholarly-looking man in his 30s. "Geoffrey, do introduce our guests. I'm Helena Cartwright, Monsieur Poirot. My brother has told me about you, and this is Mr. Philip Daventry, Geoffrey's secretary." Philip Daventry shook hands with a slight nervousness that Poirot noted with interest. The secretary had the look of a man who lived among papers and accounts, with ink-stained fingers and a preoccupied air. "I say," a hearty voice boomed, "is this the famous Belgian detective chap?" A red-faced man in tweed stumped over. "Colonel Bantry, read about some of your cases. Fascinating stuff. You are too kind, Colonel." "Not at all. Takes brains, detective work. Not like soldiering. That's just courage and following orders." The Colonel laughed at his own assessment. Throughout the evening, as more guests arrived and gathered for dinner, Poirot observed. He noted the way Miss Claudia Mersham watched her cousin with barely concealed anxiety. He observed that Philip Daventry seemed to hover near Mrs. Cartwright with an attention that went beyond mere courtesy. He saw how Edmund Crowe, the business partner, a stout man with calculating eyes, studied Geoffrey Mersham with an expression that might have been admiration, or might have been something less pleasant. And he noticed James Blackwood, the business rival, sitting somewhat apart, drinking steadily and watching the company with a sardonic smile. At dinner, Poirot found himself seated between Miss Dorothea Sims and Mrs. Vera Crowe. Miss Sims was a handsome woman of middle years, well-dressed and poised, though there was a brittleness to her gaiety that suggested disappointment long concealed. "You knew Mr. Mersham many years ago, I understand?" Poirot inquired politely. "Oh, ancient history, Monsieur Poirot." Her laugh was forced. "We were engaged briefly a lifetime ago, but Geoffrey had ambitions that didn't include a penniless parson's daughter. He went to India to seek his fortune, and I married a country solicitor. All very ordinary and sensible, but you have remained friends. Geoffrey is generous with his old acquaintances, and I'm a widow now of modest means. I don't refuse invitations to houses like Willowmere." There was no bitterness in her tone, only a worldly acceptance. Mrs. Vera Crowe, on his other side, proved less forthcoming. She was a pale, nervous woman who started at sudden noises and seemed perpetually anxious. "My husband's business with Mr. Mersham," she said in response to Poirot's gentle questioning. "I don't understand it, I'm afraid. I only know that Edmund seems perpetually worried these days." "Worried? About what, madame?" But she only shook her head and applied herself to her soup. After dinner, the men remained for port, while the ladies withdrew. Geoffrey Mersham was in excellent spirits, regaling the company with stories of his early days in the import trade. India in the old days, gentlemen. Now, that was adventure. Making deals in bazaars, learning to read the faces of merchants, understanding that business is as much about psychology as it is about pounds and pence. "Some might say you learned too well," James Blackwood said suddenly, his words slightly slurred. "Psychology, was it? Or simply knowing how to take advantage?" An uncomfortable silence fell. Geoffrey's smile didn't waver. "My dear Blackwood, I hope you're not still brooding over that cotton contract. Business is business. No hard feelings. No hard feelings." Blackwood's face had flushed. "You undercut me by 5% and stole my largest customer. Cost me thousands. That's competition, old man. If you can't stand the heat, perhaps you should have stayed out of the kitchen." Geoffrey's tone was light, but there was steel underneath. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat loudly. "I say, shall we join the ladies? I believe Mrs. Cartwright mentioned bridge. The moment passed, but Poirot had observed with great interest. Here was motive, certainly. James Blackwood had reason to resent Geoffrey Mersham. But was it sufficient reason for murder? Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Poirot rose early and took a solitary stroll through the gardens before breakfast. The grounds of Willowmere were extensive, with formal gardens near the house, giving way to parkland dotted with ancient oaks. A small lake glittered in the distance. As he rounded a hedge of rhododendrons, he came upon an unexpected scene. Philip Daventry and Mrs. Helena Cartwright stood close together in what appeared to be intense conversation. At Poirot's approach, they sprang apart with visible guilt. "Monsieur Poirot!" Helena's voice was overly bright. "How lovely the morning is. Philip was just showing me, that is, we were discussing the arrangements for the party tonight," Philip finished smoothly. Mrs. Cartwright wanted to ensure everything was perfect for her brother's celebration. "But naturally," Poirot murmured. "A birthday. It is an important occasion." He continued his walk, but his mind was active. An affair between the secretary and the master's sister. It would explain certain glances he had observed at dinner, and if Geoffrey Mersham disapproved of such an attachment, for a wealthy widow would surely be expected to marry better than a secretary, it might provide a motive. But for whom? The sister who might want her freedom, or the secretary who might eliminate an obstacle to his advancement? At breakfast, Poirot found Hastings already at table with Miss Claudia Mersham. "Poirot, Miss Mersham has been telling me about the estate. Apparently Geoffrey inherited it from an uncle who made his fortune in railways." "Indeed." Poirot helped himself to eggs and bacon. "And you, mademoiselle, you are also an heir." Claudia shook her head. "The old uncle left everything to Geoffrey. The estate, his investments, everything. Geoffrey was his favourite. I received a small legacy, enough to live on modestly, but nothing compared to what Geoffrey inherited." "And your cousin, he has been generous?" "Geoffrey? He's been kind enough, I suppose. He pays me a small allowance and invites me here occasionally, but we're not especially close." She paused, then added quietly, "Though I wouldn't want anything to happen to him for all that." "Has there been any further incident? Any more anonymous messages?" "Not that I'm aware of, but Geoffrey wouldn't necessarily tell me." She glanced around the breakfast room, which was filling with other guests. "I should go and see if Helena needs help with the final preparations." After she left, Hastings leaned closer to Poirot. "What do you make of it all, old chap? Think there's real danger?" "The little grey cells? They tell me yes, Hastings. There are undercurrents here. Tensions beneath the surface of polite society. We must remain vigilant." The day passed with the pleasant idleness typical of an English country house weekend. Some guests played tennis, others walked in the grounds or read in the library. Poirot spent much of the afternoon in apparently casual conversation with various members of the party. From Edmund Crowe, the business partner, he learned that Geoffrey Mersham had recently proposed dissolving their partnership. "Wants to buy me out," Crowe said, his jovial facade slipping. "Says he's looking to expand in new directions. But it's been 20 years, Monsieur Poirot, 20 years of partnership. And now he wants to push me aside. That must be most disappointing." "Disappointing? It's devastating. I built that business with him, and the price he's offering, it's barely fair market value. I'm not a young man, Monsieur Poirot. At my age, starting over." From Colonel Bantry, Poirot heard a different perspective. Known Geoffrey since he was a boy. Brilliant chap. Absolutely brilliant. But ruthless, I won't deny it. His first wife, poor Eleanor, she died under rather tragic circumstances. Fell down the stairs here at Willowmere. Never quite seemed like an accident to me, though the inquest said it was. Geoffrey had been furious with her about something. Finances, I believe. They'd quarrelled the night before. You suspect? I suspect nothing, sir. Not officially. But Geoffrey got her fortune when she died, and he'd been in financial difficulties at the time. Convenient, one might say. Miss Dorothea Sims provided yet another piece of the puzzle. Walking with Poirot in the rose garden, she confided, "Geoffrey came to see me last month, out of the blue, after years of barely speaking. He wanted to know if I'd ever married again. I mean, after my husband died. When I said no, he seemed pleased. He said he'd made a provision for me in his new will. Can you imagine? After all these years? Perhaps he wished to make amends for the past? Perhaps. Or perhaps he was feeling his mortality. 50 years old tomorrow. That's the age at which his father died, you know. Heart attack." As the afternoon wore on, Poirot's mental picture of Geoffrey Mersham grew more complex. A successful businessman, certainly, but also a man who had left wounded feelings in his wake. A man whose first wife had died conveniently. A man who was now making changes to his will and dissolving partnerships. The little grey cells. They began to see a pattern. The birthday dinner that evening was a magnificent affair. Mrs. Cartwright had outdone herself with the arrangements. The dining room blazed with candles. The table groaned with delicacies, and champagne flowed freely. Geoffrey Mersham presided over it all with obvious satisfaction. He had dressed for the occasion in full evening wear, and with his distinguished grey hair and commanding presence, he looked every inch the successful man of affairs. "My friends," he said when the main course had been cleared away, "I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate with me. 50 years, it seems impossible. But I look around this table and I see the people who've made my life worth living. Family, friends, business associates. What more could a man ask? Hear, hear!" Colonel Bantry raised his glass. "I know there have been, shall we say, some bumps in the road, some disagreements, some disappointments." Geoffrey's eyes moved around the table, touching briefly on James Blackwood, Edmund Crowe, Dorothea Sims. "But I believe in making amends, in setting things right. Tomorrow, I'm going to make some announcements that I think will please certain people here. But tonight is for celebration." The cake was brought in, an elaborate confection of 5 tiers. As Geoffrey prepared to cut it, a sudden crash from the hallway made everyone jump. Parsons appeared in the doorway, his professional composure shaken. "I beg your pardon, sir. A window in the library has been broken. It appears someone threw a rock through it." Geoffrey frowned. "A rock? Are you certain?" "Yes, sir. And there's a note attached." The atmosphere in the dining room changed instantly. Geoffrey strode out, followed by most of the guests. Poirot and Hastings were among them. The library window had indeed been smashed. Shattered glass littered the carpet, and on the floor lay a large stone, with a paper tied to it with string. Geoffrey picked it up, his face darkening as he read. "Another anonymous message?" Mrs. Cartwright asked anxiously. "Yes." Geoffrey's voice was grim. He read aloud, "Your time is up. Tomorrow you die." A collective gasp ran through the assembled guests. Only James Blackwood laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Told you you'd made enemies, Geoffrey. This has gone far enough." Colonel Bantry's face was purple with indignation. "This is a clear threat. We must call the police. No!" Geoffrey's voice was flat. "I won't have my birthday celebration ruined by some cowardly prankster. Parsons, have the window boarded up. Ladies and gentlemen, please return to the dining room. This changes nothing, but it changed everything." The festive atmosphere was shattered as thoroughly as the window. Guests returned to the dining room, but conversation was muted, forced. Even the cake-cutting ceremony was subdued. Poirot observed it all with his bright, intelligent eyes. He noted how Philip Daventry hovered protectively near Mrs. Cartwright, how Edmund Crowe had gone quite pale, how Miss Claudia Mersham looked at her cousin with an expression of horror and pity. And he noted something else. James Blackwood had left the dinner table shortly before the window was broken. He had claimed he needed air, had stepped out to the terrace for a cigarette. Time enough, certainly, to walk around to the library window and hurl a rock through it. After dinner, as guests dispersed to the drawing-room or their chambers, Poirot drew Hastings aside. "Tonight, mon ami, we must be vigilant. I do not like this situation. It has the feeling of, how do you say, the calm before the storm." "You think something will happen?" "I think, Hastings, that someone has gone to considerable trouble to threaten Geoffrey Mersham. The question is, was it meant merely to frighten, or is it the prelude to action? Should we warn him? Stay close to him?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "Monsieur Mersham, he will not welcome the protection. He has made that clear. No, we can only watch and wait, and hope that the little grey cells have not failed to see what is coming." They did not have long to wait. The household retired late that night, the tension of the broken window having made everyone restless. Poirot, always a light sleeper, was awakened at precisely 3:17 a.m. by a sound that was unmistakable. A gunshot. He was out of bed instantly, throwing on his dressing gown. In the corridor, he nearly collided with Hastings, similarly attired. "Did you hear?" "Yes, come quickly." They rushed down the stairs, following the sound of voices. A light showed under the door of Geoffrey's study. As they reached it, the door burst open, and Miss Claudia Mersham stumbled out, her face white, one hand pressed to her mouth. "He's dead," she whispered. "Geoffrey is dead." Inside the study, the scene was one that would remain etched in Poirot's memory. Geoffrey Mersham sat slumped in his leather desk chair, his head thrown back, a neat bullet hole in his temple. A revolver lay on the desk before him. Blood stained his white evening shirt. Other guests were arriving now, awakened by the shot. Mrs. Cartwright appeared, took one look at her brother's body, and collapsed into Philip Daventry's arms with a scream. Colonel Bantry pushed through the crowd, military training asserting itself. "Nobody touch anything." "Has someone telephoned for the police?" "Parsons is doing so now," Hastings reported. Poirot moved carefully around the room, his eyes taking in every detail. The revolver on the desk, the single glass of whiskey half consumed, the desk diary open to tomorrow's date. No, today's date now, with various appointments noted. The window closed and locked from the inside. "Suicide," Edmund Crowe said heavily from the doorway. "Poor devil, the threats must have unhinged him." "Or perhaps," James Blackwood said with grim satisfaction, "the guilt finally caught up with him." Poirot said nothing, but his mind was racing. Suicide. It was possible, certainly. A man facing threats, perhaps knowing that old sins were catching up with him. And yet, Hastings, observe please. What do you see? Hastings studied the scene. Well, the gun is on the desk. He must have shot himself and dropped it. And the wound? Temple, right temple. Hastings paused. "I say, Poirot, Geoffrey was right-handed, wasn't he? I remember him cutting the cake at dinner." "Precisely. And the gun, it lies near his right hand. All appears correct for suicide, does it not?" Poirot's tone suggested otherwise. "But you don't think it was suicide?" "I think, mon ami, that we must wait for the police and the doctor, and then we must apply the little grey cells to this problem, because someone in this house is a murderer, and that someone has been very clever, but not, perhaps, quite clever enough." Inspector Morrison of the Sussex Police arrived at dawn, along with the police surgeon, Dr. Pemberton. Morrison was a solid, methodical man who listened to Poirot's account with careful attention. "So you're the famous Belgian detective Miss Mersham invited down?" Well, we're grateful for your presence, Mr. Poirot. This is a nasty business. Dr. Pemberton's examination was thorough. Death occurred between 3 and 3:30 a.m., consistent with the time the shot was heard. Single bullet wound to the right temple. Death would have been instantaneous. He paused. Of course, I'll need to conduct a full post-mortem, but at first glance, it appears consistent with suicide. But you have doubts? Poirot asked. I always have doubts until the evidence is complete, Mr. Poirot. The position of the body is somewhat unusual. The angle of the wound could suggest either suicide or murder, and there are no powder burns on his hand, which one might expect if he'd held the gun close to his temple. Inspector Morrison made notes. We'll need to interview everyone in the house. Where were they when the shot was fired? Did anyone hear or see anything unusual? He looked at Poirot. I'd appreciate your assistance, sir, if you're willing. But naturally, Hercule Poirot is always pleased to assist the police. The interviews began in the drawing room. Poirot and Hastings sat with Inspector Morrison as each guest was questioned in turn. Mrs. Helena Cartwright, pale and composed now after her initial collapse. I was in my room, asleep. The shot woke me. I threw on my robe and ran downstairs. I saw Claudia coming out of Geoffrey's study, and then I saw my brother. Miss Claudia Mersham, still shaken. I couldn't sleep. I was worried about Geoffrey after those threats. I came downstairs to check on him. I thought I heard voices from his study. When I opened the door, I found him, like that, dead. You heard voices? Poirot interrupted gently. More than one. I'm not certain. It might have been just Geoffrey speaking to himself. Or perhaps the wireless was on. I can't be sure. Everything is so confused. Philip Daventry, the secretary, nervously twisting his hands. I was in my room. The shot woke me like everyone else. I saw Mrs. Cartwright in the corridor and followed her downstairs. Edmund Crowe, in my room with my wife. We both heard the shot. Terrible business. I suppose the threats pushed him over the edge. James Blackwood, less drunk now, but defensive. In my room, sleeping it off. Look here, Inspector, I know I quarrelled with Mersham, but I didn't kill him. Why would I? I had no reason to want him dead. No reason? Poirot asked mildly. But you had lost business because of him. You said so yourself. Lost business isn't a motive for murder. I was angry, yes, but not murderous. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, Miss Dorothea Sims, the Fletchers, all had similar stories. They were in their rooms, heard the shot, came downstairs to investigate. After the interviews, Inspector Morrison rubbed his eyes wearily. What do you make of it, Mr. Poirot? The evidence points to suicide, but something doesn't feel right. I agree, Inspector. There are several points that trouble me. First, the angle of the wound. The doctor himself was uncertain. Second, no powder burns on the hand. Third, Miss Mersham heard voices, or thought she did. And fourth, Poirot paused dramatically. Yes, fourth, there is the matter of the threatening notes. Why would a man who was planning suicide send himself threatening notes? Morrison frowned. Perhaps he wasn't planning suicide. Perhaps the notes were real threats. And he decided to end things himself rather than wait for his enemy to act. It is possible, but I think there is another explanation. With your permission, Inspector, I would like to examine the study more thoroughly. Poirot spent the remainder of the morning in Geoffrey Mersham's study, much to the frustration of Inspector Morrison, who wanted the body removed and the room sealed. Just a few more moments, Inspector. The little grey cells, they require certain information. Hastings watched as Poirot examined every inch of the room with minute care. He studied the position of the body, now covered with a sheet. He examined the revolver, holding it carefully with his handkerchief. He looked at the whiskey glass, sniffing it delicately. He examined the desk, the papers, the diary. "Hastings, what do you observe about this room?" Hastings looked around. "It's a study. Books, desk, fireplace. Everything quite neat and orderly. Exactement. Neat and orderly. Monsieur Mersham, he was a methodical man. Look at his desk. Papers in perfect piles, blotter clean, pens aligned just so. And yet what? And yet on this night, when he was supposedly so distraught that he took his own life, he did not leave a note. No explanation, no farewell. Is that the action of a methodical man? Perhaps he didn't want to explain. Perhaps he was too upset to write. Perhaps. But observe also the whiskey. It is half consumed, yes. But Monsieur Mersham, he drank brandy, not whiskey. I noticed this at dinner. When the port was passed, he requested brandy. Maybe he changed his mind. Or maybe someone else poured that whiskey. Poirot moved to the window. And look here, the window is locked from the inside. The murderer, if there was a murderer, must have left by the door. Then it must have been someone in the house. Obviously. The question is who? Poirot picked up the desk diary and flipped through the pages. Interesting. Look at the entries for today. 9 a.m. Meeting with Daventry Alley accounts. 11 a.m. Crow, final settlement. 2 p.m. Solicitor Thornton, new will signing. And here, at 3 p.m., he has written simply, D.S. Tell the truth. D.S.? That would be Dorothea Sims. So it would appear. Monsieur Mersham planned a very busy day for his birthday. Meetings, a will signing, and some truth-telling with Miss Sims. These do not sound like the plans of a man contemplating suicide. Inspector Morrison had been listening. You're suggesting murder, then? But how? The door wasn't locked. Anyone could have walked in and shot him. But no one heard an argument. No one saw anyone entering or leaving the study except Miss Mersham, who found the body. Ah, but there is the cleverness of it, Inspector. Poirot's eyes gleamed. The murderer has been most ingenious. But ingenuity, it sometimes overreaches itself. There is always the small detail that does not fit. And what small detail have you found? Several, mon ami. First, there is the matter of the threatening notes. I have given them much thought. They were meant to establish a narrative, that Geoffrey Mersham had enemies who wished him dead, that when he died it would not be surprising. But if they were sent by the murderer as a setup, why make them so dramatic? Why not let the suicide seem spontaneous? Because, Inspector, the murderer needed time to plan, time to prepare. And the notes served another purpose. They allowed the murderer to gauge Monsieur Mersham's reaction. Would he take them seriously? Would he seek protection? The murderer needed to know these things. Poirot moved back to the desk and picked up a small object Hastings hadn't noticed before. A metal button, the kind used on men's suits. And then there is this. I found it on the floor beside the desk. It is not from Monsieur Mersham's clothing. I have checked. It is from the suit of the murderer, torn off during the struggle. Struggle? But there was no sign of struggle. No obvious sign, perhaps. But the position of the body. The doctor noted it was somewhat unusual, yes? I believe Monsieur Mersham was not seated when he was shot. I believe he was standing, confronting his murderer. And after he was shot, the murderer arranged the body in the chair to appear as suicide. But why would he confront his murderer at 3 in the morning? Ah, that is the question, is it not? Poirot smiled. But I think I know the answer. Monsieur Mersham had planned meetings for today. Important meetings. But someone could not wait for those meetings to take place. Someone needed to act last night before certain truths came to light. And so that someone lured Monsieur Mersham to his study with a message, perhaps claiming to have information about the threats, or wishing to confess to sending them. Monsieur Mersham came down, and he was murdered. But who? Morrison asked in frustration. Who had access to him? Who could have sent him such a message? Ah, Inspector, that I will reveal. But first, I must verify one small thing. Hastings, you will accompany me. Inspector, I ask for just a few more hours. This evening, I will gather everyone in the drawing room, and I will tell you who killed Geoffrey Mersham. That evening, the drawing room at Willowmere held a subdued gathering. Inspector Morrison had agreed to Poirot's request, though with obvious reluctance. The guests, prevented from leaving until the investigation was complete, assembled with varying degrees of anxiety. Poirot stood before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly as he surveyed the room. Hastings sat to one side, notebook in hand, as he had done so many times before. "Mesdames and messieurs," Poirot began, "we are gathered here to solve a murder. The murder of Geoffrey Mersham, who died last night in his study from a gunshot wound to the head. We know all that," James Blackwood said irritably. "What we don't know is who did it, if anyone did. The police seem to think it was suicide." "Ah, but it was not suicide, monsieur. That is what the murderer wished us to believe. But the evidence, she tells a different story." Poirot began to pace slowly. "Let us consider the facts. Geoffrey Mersham was a successful man who had made enemies. This is not unusual. What is unusual is that someone began sending him threatening notes. Anonymous notes, made from letters, cut from newspapers. The work of a coward, Colonel Bantry muttered. Or the work of someone who wished to establish a pattern. Someone who wanted us to believe that Monsieur Mersham had enemies who meant him harm, so that when he died, it would seem either that he had been driven to suicide by these threats, or that one of his enemies had made good on their promise. But I don't understand," Mrs. Vera Crowe said nervously. "If it wasn't suicide, how did the murderer escape? The window was locked. Miss Mersham found the body almost immediately after the shot." "Ah, that is because Miss Mersham was meant to find the body, madam. She was, how do you say, the perfect witness. She could not sleep because she was worried about her cousin. She came downstairs to check on him, and she found him dead. Who would suspect her? She is the one who hired me to protect him." Claudia Mersham had gone very pale. "You can't think that I—" "No, mademoiselle, I do not think you killed your cousin. But I think someone knew your habits. Someone knew you were worried, and would likely come downstairs to check on Monsieur Mersham. Someone who wanted a reliable witness to discover the body quickly, before any suspicions could arise." Poirot paused, his gaze moving around the room. "The question then becomes, who could have committed this murder? Who had motive, opportunity, and the necessary ruthlessness? Let us examine the motives first." He began to tick off on his fingers. "Mr. Blackwood, you had lost business because of Geoffrey Mersham's competition. You were angry, vocal in your resentment. Mr. Crow, your partnership was being dissolved, and you faced financial ruin. Mrs. Sims, you were once rejected by Geoffrey Mersham, left to marry a country solicitor while he went off to make his fortune. Mrs. Cartwright, your brother controlled your inheritance, and you wished to marry Mr. Daventry, but Geoffrey disapproved. Helena Cartwright gasped. Philip Daventry leapt to his feet. How did you... It was obvious to one who observes, monsieur. The glances, the private conversations in the garden. But please, sit down. I have not finished. Poirot continued. And Mr. Daventry himself, as secretary, you knew all of Geoffrey's business. Perhaps you knew secrets that made you dangerous. Or perhaps you wanted Mrs. Cartwright's hand and her fortune. This is outrageous, Daventry sputtered. It is merely facts, monsieur. And there is one more person with motive, one we have not yet discussed properly. The person who stood to inherit the most from Geoffrey Mersham's death. The person who was to sign a new will today, but who could not allow that will to be signed. The room was utterly silent. Poirot let the tension build. You see, I learned something most interesting from Monsieur Mersham's solicitor this afternoon. The new will would have made significant changes. It would have provided generous bequests to several people. Miss Sims, Mrs. Cartwright, even Mr. Crow, as compensation for the partnership dissolution. But it would have drastically reduced the inheritance of one person, a person who, under the old will, inherited everything, a person who could not afford to let that new will be signed. Who? Inspector Morrison demanded. Poirot turned to face one end of the room. Miss Claudia Mersham. The gasp that went through the room was audible. Claudia herself remained frozen, her face white. No, she whispered. No, you're wrong. Am I? Let us examine the facts. You came to my flat with a threatening note, claiming to be worried about your cousin. You begged me to come to Willowmere to protect him, but in reality you were setting the stage for murder. You knew I would focus on others, on those with obvious motives like Mr. Blackwood or Mr. Crow. You would be above suspicion, the devoted cousin who tried to save him. But I didn't kill him. I found him dead. Oh, you found him dead, certainly. You found him dead because you had just shot him, mademoiselle. You sent him a note. Perhaps you claimed to have discovered who was sending the threats. You asked him to meet you in his study at 3 a.m. He came, and you were waiting with his own revolver taken from his desk drawer earlier. You shot him, arranged the body to look like suicide, and then you raised the alarm. No! This is madness, is it? Then perhaps you can explain this. Poirot held up the button he had found. This button is from a woman's suit jacket, mademoiselle. I have examined the clothing of all the ladies in this house. It matches perfectly the suit you wore yesterday. And there is a button missing from that suit. I have verified this with the maid who unpacked your case. Claudia was shaking her head desperately. A button proves nothing. It could have come off any time. I visited Geoffrey's study several times this weekend. True, but there is something else. You said you heard voices from the study before you entered. But mademoiselle, if Monsieur Mersham had just shot himself, there could be no voices unless you were confusing your story. Unless you were remembering the argument you had with him before you shot him. I want a solicitor. I won't say anything more. Inspector Morrison stepped forward. Miss Mersham, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to come with me for further questioning. But Poirot held up his hand. Un moment, Inspecteur. I have not quite finished. You see, there is a problem with my theory. A very significant problem. Everyone stared at him. Claudia Mersham looked up with desperate hope. The problem, Poirot said slowly, is that Miss Mersham did not kill Geoffrey Mersham. She found him dead exactly as she said, and while she had motive, the strongest motive of all, she did not commit this murder." The room erupted in confusion. "But you just said," Morrison began. "I said many things, Inspector. I laid out a case against Miss Mersham. It was a good case, no? It had motive, opportunity, even physical evidence, the button. But it had one fatal flaw." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Miss Claudia Mersham is left-handed." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Hastings spoke up. "But Poirot, what difference does that make?" "All the difference in the world, mon ami. You see, the murderer tried to make this look like suicide. Geoffrey Mersham was right-handed. Therefore, he would shoot himself in the right temple with his right hand. The gun would fall near his right hand. All was arranged to look like right-handed suicide. But Miss Mersham is left-handed. If she had shot her cousin, her instinct would have been to hold the gun in her left hand. She would not have had the psychological presence of mind to switch hands, shoot with her unnatural hand, and arrange everything to look like right-handed suicide. No, the murderer had to be someone right-handed, someone who would naturally think about these details." Poirot turned slowly, his gaze moving across the room until it settled on one person. "Someone like you, Mr. Philip Daventry." Philip Daventry had gone very still. His face, always pale, had turned the colour of parchment. Mrs. Helena Cartwright made a small sound of distress. "Philip? No, it's impossible. He was in his room. I saw him in the corridor after the shot was fired." "You saw him in the corridor?" "Yes, madame. But what does that prove? His room is close to the back stairs. He could easily have gone down, committed the murder, and returned to his room. When the alarm was raised, he appeared with everyone else. But why?" Helena's voice was anguished. "Why would Philip kill Geoffrey? Ah, that is the interesting question." Poirot began to walk slowly toward Daventry, who seemed paralyzed. "At first I thought perhaps it was for you, madam. You wished to marry, but your brother disapproved. If Geoffrey died, you would inherit and be free to marry whom you chose. But then I realized there was another reason, a reason connected to those appointments in Geoffrey's diary." Poirot turned to address the room. "Geoffrey Mersham planned to meet with his secretary this morning to discuss accounts. I asked myself why. A birthday morning, surely not the time for business, unless there was something wrong with the accounts. Unless Geoffrey had discovered that his secretary had been embezzling from him." Daventry found his voice at last. "That's a lie, a vicious lie, is it? I had a long conversation with Geoffrey's solicitor and his banker this afternoon, Mr. Daventry. Geoffrey had indeed discovered irregularities in the accounts. Small amounts at first, a few pounds here and there. But over time the amounts had grown. You had been stealing from him for over 2 years, and you had taken nearly £10,000. A gasp went through the room. Helena Cartwright looked at Philip with horror. £10,000? But Philip, how could you? I needed it. The words burst from Daventry. You don't understand. My father died in debt. I had creditors hounding me. I was desperate. And Geoffrey was so wealthy. I thought he'd never notice. But he did notice, Poirot said quietly. And he set a trap for you. He told you he wanted to review the accounts on his birthday morning. He wanted to confront you with the evidence. And you knew that when he did, you would face prison. So you decided to act first. You can't prove this, Daventry said. But his voice lacked conviction. Oh, but I can. You see, you made several mistakes. The first was the threatening notes. You sent them to establish that Geoffrey had enemies. You hoped that when he died, the finger would point elsewhere. Perhaps to Mr. Blackwood or Mr. Crowe, both of whom had public grievances. But you did not realize that the very existence of those notes pointed towards someone with inside knowledge, someone who could access Geoffrey's study to steal his personal stationery for the envelope, Someone who could watch his reactions and know that he would dismiss the threats as pranks. Poirot continued, his voice measured and relentless. Your second mistake was more subtle. You wrote in Geoffrey's diary yourself, did you not? The appointment for 9 a.m. Meeting with Daventry Re accounts. I wondered about the handwriting. It is very like Geoffrey's, but not quite. You are his secretary. You have imitated his hand many times on business documents. You wrote that appointment to give yourself an excuse to be in the study early, to remove evidence of your theft before the real reckoning came. This is all speculation, Daventry said desperately. Is it? Then perhaps you can explain how you knew that Claudia Mersham would come downstairs at precisely 3 a.m. You needed a witness who would find the body quickly and confirm that it looked like suicide. But how could you be certain she would come? Unless you sent her a note too. A note supposedly from Geoffrey, asking her to meet him in the study. A note that you slipped under her door. Claudia Mersham stood up. There was a note. I found it under my door when I woke up. It said Geoffrey wanted to talk to me about the threats. I thought he was finally taking them seriously. But when I got to the study, you found him dead, yes, because Mr. Daventry had sent that note to you 30 minutes before Geoffrey's actual death. He lured Geoffrey down first with some pretext, perhaps claiming to want to confess about the money and beg for mercy. Geoffrey came down in his dressing gown. They argued, and then Mr. Daventry shot him. Inspector Morrison had moved closer to Daventry. The button, Mr. Poirot. You said it was from Miss Mersham's suit. Ah, the button. That was misdirection on my part, Inspector. A test, if you will. The button is actually from Mr. Daventry's suit jacket. The jacket he wore yesterday. The same jacket in which I observed a button hanging by a thread at dinner. During the struggle with Geoffrey, that button was torn completely off. Mr. Daventry tried to claim it was from Miss Mersham's suit, but I checked with the maid. Miss Mersham's suit has all its buttons intact. It is Mr. Daventry's jacket that is missing a button, a jacket he attempted to hide at the back of his wardrobe, but which I discovered this afternoon. You searched my room. You had no right. On the contrary, I had the inspector's permission. And we found something else most interesting in your room, did we not, Inspector? Morrison nodded grimly. A half-empty bottle of sleeping powder. The same sleeping powder that was found in Geoffrey Mersham's whiskey glass. You drugged his drink first, Mr. Daventry. You wanted to make sure he couldn't fight back effectively. Daventry's resistance crumbled. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. He was going to destroy me, he said dully. 10 years hard labor for embezzlement. My life would have been ruined. And all for a few £1,000s that meant nothing to him. Nothing. He had so much, and I had nothing. It wasn't fair. Helena Cartwright was weeping quietly. Oh, Philip, how could you? If you'd needed money, I would have helped you. If you'd told me the truth. I couldn't tell you, Daventry said bitterly. You would have despised me. You would never have married a thief. But I thought if Geoffrey died and you inherited, we could be together. You would have been wealthy enough for both of us. It would have been perfect. Perfect? Helena's voice was filled with anguish. You murdered my brother. How could that ever be perfect? Inspector Morrison stepped forward. Philip Daventry, I am arresting you for the murder of Geoffrey Mersham. You need not say anything. But anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence. As Daventry was led away, still protesting weakly, the drawing room slowly emptied. Guests departed to their rooms or stood in small groups, talking in hushed voices. The nightmare was over, but the shock would linger. The next morning, Poirot and Hastings prepared to return to London. The house party had dissolved, guests departing with relief to escape the scene of tragedy. Only Helena Cartwright remained, the new mistress of Willowmere by virtue of her brother's death. She met them in the morning room as they waited for their car. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, I wanted to thank you before you left, and to apologize. Apologize, madame. For what? For Philip. I had no idea about the embezzlement. If I had known, perhaps I could have prevented all this. Geoffrey would still be alive. Do not blame yourself, madam. You're Mr. Daventry. He was skilled at deception. It is his nature. You could not have known. I suppose not. But it's hard not to feel that I should have seen something. Some sign." She paused. "Geoffrey's will was read this morning. The old will, of course. The new one was never signed. I inherit everything as Philip knew I would. It's almost too terrible to bear. Benefiting from my brother's death. You did not cause his death, madam. That guilt belongs to another. Still, I think I shall sell Willowmere. Too many memories now. I shall move to Bath, perhaps. Start fresh somewhere new." She managed a wan smile. "At least I'll be free to marry whom I choose now. Though after this, I don't think I shall choose anyone for quite some time." In the car on the way to the station, Hastings was thoughtful. "I say, Poirot, that business about the button. You really had me going there. I thought for certain you believed Claudia Mersham was guilty." "It was necessary to smoke out the real killer, mon ami. By presenting a strong case against Miss Mersham, I made Mr. Daventry believe he might escape after all. But then, when I revealed the flaw in that case, the matter of right-handed versus left-handed, the psychological pressure became too great. He knew I was circling closer to the truth." "But how did you really know it was Daventry? I mean, before all the evidence with the buttons and the sleeping powder?" Poirot smiled. "It was the little grey cells, Hastings. They considered the facts. Who had access to Geoffrey's study at all hours? Who could forge appointments in his diary? Who would know about his plans to review the accounts? The secretary. Always the secretary. And when I learned about the embezzlement, it all became clear. Mr. Daventry faced exposure and ruin. Geoffrey's death was his only escape. Rather a drastic escape. Indeed. But you see, Hastings, that is the tragedy of the criminal mind. It always believes itself cleverer than it is. Mr. Daventry thought he could arrange the perfect suicide. He would drug Geoffrey's drink to make him compliant, shoot him, arrange the body, plant the gun, and then retreat to his room. When Miss Mersham arrived, summoned by his note, she would find the body and raise the alarm. The threatening letters would make suicide seem plausible, and if anyone suspected murder, the list of suspects was long. Blackwood, Crowe, even Miss Sims. Who would suspect the quiet, efficient secretary? But he didn't count on Hercule Poirot being present. No, mon ami, that was his greatest mistake. Poirot adjusted his moustaches with satisfaction. The little grey cells, they do not miss the details that matter. The angle of a wound, the absence of powder burns, the presence of sleeping powder where there should be none, a button torn off in a struggle, and most of all, the psychology. A man planning suicide does not make appointments for the next day. He does not plan to sign a new will and settle accounts. He has already mentally left the world. But a man planning to commit murder, that is different. He thinks ahead, he plans, and in his planning, he makes the small mistakes that lead to his downfall. At the station, as they waited for the London train, Hastings bought newspapers. The case was already making headlines. Country house murder, solved by famous detective. Poirot read the account with amusement. They make it sound so simple, Hastings, as if one merely walks into a room, observes for 5 minutes, and pronounces the murderer's name. Isn't that more or less what you did? But there is a difference between the appearance of simplicity and true simplicity. The little grey cells, they worked very hard on this case. Many possibilities were considered and discarded. Many theories were tested. Only then did the truth emerge. Still another triumph for Hercule Poirot. A triumph for order over chaos, mon ami. That is what matters. A man has been murdered, and justice has been served. The world is restored to balance. Poirot settled into his seat as the train pulled away from the station. Though I confess I will be glad to return to London. The English countryside, it is very beautiful, but also very dangerous, n'est-ce pas? Give me the safety of the city any day. Hastings laughed. Oh, I don't know. I rather enjoyed it. Good food, pleasant company, well, mostly pleasant, and a puzzle to solve. What more could one ask? What more indeed? Poirot closed his eyes, his hands folded neatly over his waistcoat. Though next time, Hastings, perhaps we might enjoy a weekend in the country without anyone getting murdered. Do you think that is possible? With your reputation, Poirot? I rather doubt it. Wherever you go, murder seems to follow. Ah, but it is not that murder follows me, mon ami. It is that I follow murder, and I will continue to do so, for as long as the little grey cells continue to function. Because someone must stand for order. Someone must speak for the victims who cannot speak for themselves. Someone must ensure that the guilty do not escape justice. Quite right, Hastings said warmly. And thank heavens that someone is you. Poirot smiled, his eyes still closed. You are too kind, my friend, too kind. Now, if you will excuse me, I shall take a small nap. Solving murders, it is most exhausting work. Wake me when we approach London. As the train carried them back toward the city, the Sussex countryside rolled past the windows. Peaceful, pastoral, and beautiful, Willowmere grew smaller in the distance, its honey-coloured stone glowing in the morning sun. It looked serene and lovely, giving no hint of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. But such was the way of the world. Poirot reflected drowsily. Evil often wore a pleasant face. Murder could lurk beneath the most civilized of surfaces. And human nature, with all its vanity, greed, and weakness, remained the same whether one was in London or the English countryside. It was the eternal puzzle, the endless mystery. Not just who committed the crime, but why. What drove a man like Philip Daventry to murder? Greed, yes. Fear of exposure, certainly. But also pride and the refusal to accept responsibility for one's own failings. It was easier to kill than to admit wrongdoing. Easier to destroy another life than to rebuild one's own. These were the thoughts of Hercule Poirot as the train sped toward London. These and the comfortable reflection that once again order had been restored, justice had been served, and the little grey cells had proved themselves equal to the task. In the end, that was all that mattered.